Welcome to our second panel. We'll now begin the second part of our hearing today. And today we have with us Mr. James Shirk, who is a Senior Policy Analyst in Labor Economics at the Heritage Foundation. We also have Dr. Andrew Biggs, a Resident Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Max Steyer is the President and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, and Ms. Colleen Kelly is the National President of the National Treasury Employees Union. If you all wouldn't mind, please stand to be sworn in pursuant to committee rules. All witnesses must be sworn in. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. I will now recognize each of you for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. The transcript, of course, has been submitted for the record. And Mr. Shirk, we will start off with you. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Ross, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is James Shirk, and I am a Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing an official position of the Heritage Foundation. I want to explain to you this afternoon that the Federal pay system is broken. As a consequence of its failings, the average Federal employee earns significantly more than they would in the private sector. There are 3 features of the Federal pay system that Congress should be aware of. The first feature is that it does a poor job of approximating market pay. The general schedule places heavy emphasis on internal equity, so that jobs of a similar level of work receive the same pay. An engineer, an IT specialist, and a budget analyst at the same GS grade all receive the same pay. The law requires the President's pay agent to set Federal pay by determining what level of work a private sector job entails and what general schedule grade that would translate into. The pay agent then sets the Federal pay by averaging pay across the different jobs it is determined belongs in each grade. This effectively superimposes the general schedule system onto private sector payrolls. However, private sector employers do not base pay on anything remotely resembling the general schedule. Market forces such as relative supply and demand for different skills, specialties, and occupations determine private pay. Employees in different occupations performing similar, quote, levels of work often earn very different salaries. As a result, Federal pay often looks nothing like market rates in both directions. Some Federal employees earn wildly inflated salaries, 40 to 50% above what they would earn in the private sector. Other Federal employees do not receive a cash wage premium at all and may receive slightly below market rates. Typically, highly skilled workers such as scientists and lawyers do not receive premium wages in the government. The second feature of the Federal pay system that Congress should understand is that, on average, it overpays Federal employees. My research, using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, shows that after you account for education, experience, and occupations so that you can make an apples-to-apples comparison, once you do that, the average Federal employee makes 22% more an hour than they would if they were in the private sector. Including the value of their benefits raises the Federal compensation premium to between 30 and 40%. The average Federal employee earns more than they would if they were in the private sector, and paying this premium will cost taxpayers almost $50 billion this year. Many other economists with views that span the political spectrum have come to this view. Dr. Alan Krueger served as the chief economist at the Treasury Department in the Obama administration. He found that, and I am quoting him, "The Federal government appears to consistently pay higher wages than the private sector for comparable employees." Economists do not debate whether the Federal government overpays its employees. The research consistently shows that they are. It is important to emphasize, however, that this average Federal premium is only part of the total variation between Federal and market pay. It is simultaneously true that many Federal employees are not overpaid and that the Federal government pays private sector employees more on average. The only major study to disagree with this conclusion is the President's pay agent report, which uses the flawed methodology I described. No administration has ever found the results of the pay agent report credible or acted on them. The pay agent itself frequently expresses concerns with the methodology the law requires it to use. This is for good reason. If Federal employees were underpaid, then the Federal government would have severe retention problems. Just the opposite occurs. Federal employees quit their jobs just 1/3 as often as private sector workers. This happens because they know they are getting a better deal in the Federal government than they could get in the private sector. The third feature of the Federal pay system that Congress should understand is that it rewards time served, not performance. Woody Allen once observed that 90% of life is just showing up. For Federal employees, 75% of life is just showing up. Less than 1/4 of the money spent on Federal pay increases is meaningfully tied to performance. The rest is either automatic or essentially automatic. Employees on the general schedule start at the first step of their assigned job grade. As long as they receive a 3 out of 5 performance rating, they automatically receive step increases until they advance to Step 10. Managers who wish to give ratings below 3, however, bear the burden of proving that the employee performs poorly. The system assumes that Federal employees are adequate and gives them raises. Consequently, Federal managers rarely use performance ratings below 3, and, like I said, most Federal employees receive step increases. It's social promotion for adults. Unsurprisingly, then, with this system, Federal employees receive raises and promotions more rapidly than private sector workers do. My research shows that this is one of the major reasons Federal employees receive above-market pay. Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about the Federal pay system and how its flaws inflate Federal compensation.
Thank you, Mr. Shirk. Dr. Biggs, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Ross, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify with regard to Federal employment compensation. My testimony today is based upon joint research with Jason Richwine of the Heritage Foundation, and a copy of our working paper has been enclosed with my testimony. We limit our analysis to one question: do Federal employees on average receive greater compensation than these individuals could receive in the private sector? Our answer, which is consistent with several decades of economic research, is yes. To begin, you are doubtless aware of the President's pay agent, which reports that Federal jobs pay over 20% less than comparable private sector positions. You should also be aware of why most economists are skeptical of the pay agent approach. The most important reason is simply that the pay agent's approach compares apples and oranges. While the pay agent claims to compare similar Federal and private sector jobs, it does not compare similar workers. That is, it does not account for the fact that the Federal Government hires workers at higher pay grades and promotes them faster than does the private sector. For instance, a person working as a senior accountant in the Federal Government might have the experience and education of only a junior accountant in the private sector. A 1984 Congressional Budget Office study concluded that the average Federal worker resides 2/3 of a pay grade above a similar private sector employee. A 1997 academic study found a larger gap of 3/4 of a pay grade. A 2002 study using BLS occupational data showed, quote, that Federal workers have significantly fewer years of education and experience than private sector workers in the same level of responsibility in an occupation. Once this study accounted for differences in experience and education, the supposed pay penalty disappeared. So how do economists study public-private pay differences? Labor economists begin by controlling for how individual workers differ with regard to earnings-related factors such as experience, education, geographic location, and so forth. Let me reiterate here that despite what we heard throughout Director Berry's testimony and in some of the questions, the study I have conducted and that Mr. Shirk has conducted do control for differences in education between Federal employees and private sector employees. They do control for that. By controlling for these differences, you can isolate the effects on pay of working in the Federal or the private sector. Using census data from 2006 through 2010, we found that Federal employees receive average salaries 14% higher than similar workers employed by large private sector firms. This is actually a conservative comparison, since large firms offer the best salaries and benefits. If we compare to all private sector workers, the Federal salary premium rises to 22%. Some argue, however, that this method ignores relevant differences between workers. For instance, our educational data tells us only if you have a certain degree, not your GPA or the quality of the school you attended. As an alternative, we followed individual workers' salaries over time, tracking how their pay changed as they moved into or out of the government. Workers who switch between the Federal and private sectors earn about 8% more when employed by the Federal Government, and this is just the initial premium upon switching. Whether we examine different workers at the same point in time or follow the same workers over time, it is clear that most Federal employees would earn lower salaries in the private sector. Benefits are an important component of overall compensation, but comprehensive data on Federal benefits must be assembled by hand. Using OMB and OPM data, we calculated the value of a wide range of Federal benefits, from pensions and health coverage to vacation time and employee awards. On average, Federal employees receive total benefits equal to around 66% of their salaries. In large private sector firms, benefits average 50% of salaries. In other words, Federal workers receive a benefit premium of around 33% over similar private sector employees. Combined Federal salaries and benefits are roughly 25% above what similar private sector employees would receive. Economists since Adam Smith have noted that positions with greater job security should pay lower salaries, just as safe investments like bonds pay lower returns than stocks. The BLS reports that in any given year, Federal workers are less than one-third as likely as private sector employees to be fired or laid off. We estimate the value of job security using the tools of financial economics to calculate the pay reduction a private sector worker would willingly accept to have the increased job security of Federal employees. Using conservative assumptions, we find that Federal workers' job security is equivalent to an extra 11% of pay. When salaries, benefits, and job security are properly valued, the total Federal compensation package is worth upwards of 39% more than is paid to similar private sector workers. The total Federal pay premium could top $60 billion per year. Identifying the pay premium is far easier than fixing it. Simple pay freezes or furloughs are blunt instruments that will not get to the heart of the issue. Federal pay must be made to reflect market conditions, not with a one-time adjustment, but with fundamental reforms that work consistently into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biggs. Mr. Steer, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Ross, Ranking Member Lynch, and the members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I would respectfully suggest that we're asking the wrong question here. It's not whether Federal workers are underpaid or overpaid, but rather how do we move a system to a more market-sensitive system. John O'Leary at Harvard said it's the Goldilocks truth. In any group of public servants, you're going to find some that are underpaid, some that are overpaid, and some that are paid just right. Our challenge is to make sure that our government has the best talent for the best price. I would propose then we have 7 core principles that you look at in thinking about where we go from here. First, number one, obviously, we need a pay system based on the market for needed talent. We need to make sure that, again, we have competitive salaries set not just by geography, but also by occupation and the relevant factors that have been discussed already. Second, we need to account for benefits cautiously. So, yes, benefits do matter, but I don't think you can look, for example, at job security and see that as an across-the-board benefit. If you're trying to hire the very critical cybersecurity talent coming out of school today, the fact that a job may have more security isn't going to be really relevant for them. In fact, that may be a turnoff. You got to understand your talent, you got to understand what's going to appeal to them, and you got to be specific to the job, to the talent that you actually need. Third, we need to get better data. Right now, we're looking at, again, across-the-board comparisons if you look by geography, but we're not looking at the very concrete, specific surveys that most companies do when they're trying to analyze what they ought to be paying for the talent that they need. And in government, we need to do a lot better in order to get that information. Fourth, we also need to look at the quality of the hires we're looking at. This is actually a balance here. You think about what you're paying, but you have to think what you're paying for. And right now in government, we don't do a very good job of understanding what quality talent is and how to retain it. And unless we have those quality measurements, then in fact, we're not going to ever be able to design the right system, because we're not going to know whether we're getting the right value for the money that is being spent. So we need to make sure that agencies are recruiting the right talent, and we know what that right talent looks like. Number 5, we need to make sure we reform the Federal classification system. The pay system, the classification system are intertwined. Classification system wasn't designed for the world that we live in today, and we need to make sure that that's aligned with today's job market. An example, a GS-11 is someone who performs work, quote, of marked difficulty and responsibility, while a GS-12 is someone who performs work of, quote, a very high order of difficulty and responsibility. It doesn't make any sense. If you're a GS-12 engineer, HR professional, budget analyst, whatever it may be, you get paid the same. A lot of internal equity, but what that means is that you're really not actually matching the market for talent. Number 6, we need to make sure we have good workforce planning. We need to make sure that we actually know what talent we need. Today, we don't actually have a government-wide plan on the human capital that we need to make sure the government runs right, and we need that. In fact, we don't really know, we're not forecasting enterprise-wide the sorts of skills that we need to be able to succeed in the world we're going into. And that's a component piece of what we ought to be looking at here. And then number 7, we need real flexibility. If you look at the the government today, you in fact have a lot of agencies that have already been given different authority to create different systems. For example, the VA, they were finding that they couldn't actually recruit the doctors and nurses that they need, so they were given authority. Financial regulatory institutions, you have a diverse set of agencies all trying to do different things. We need to make sure that whatever is done with this system, that it permits for the flexibility to allow for the different needs of these organizations to recruit the talent that they need. So what about going forward here? I propose that there are 4 key recommendations. Number 1, this has to be a collective effort. We need the best minds. We need to make sure everyone's at the table. That includes employee groups. It includes, obviously, the best minds that know about compensation that can help design the right thing. Secondly, we need to design from where we are today. This is not a blank paper exercise. We have to design something that takes us from where we are today to where we need to go. And that may mean there are populations, for example, that may be viewed as being overpaid. Well, how do you make sure that they are treated fairly in a process of moving them to that new system? That's an extra challenge. Number 3, we need to build off of what's worked. We've had experiments in government before. We've had a demonstration project authority for 30 years. There are organizations that have tried different things. I mentioned earlier the agencies that have already been given different authority, whether it's the financial organizations or many others, GAO being another example. And we've got to be looking at and what's worked with them. And then finally, we need to take a step back and understand what success looks like. We need accountability on our end to make sure that we're actually driving towards the right outcomes. And again, that ought to be getting the right talent at the most cost-effective fashion. So Steve Covey said it best. He said the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that ought to be, again, outcomes for the American people, which requires the best talent at the most cost-effective mechanism and price. So we've got to avoid the distractions, I believe, of thinking underpaid, overpaid, and focus on that key issue. Appreciate the opportunity to be before you and hope I can answer some questions later.
Thank you, Mr. Steer. Ms. Kelly, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Ross, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today. The pay system for the large majority of white-collar Federal employees is known as the General Schedule. Its main thesis is that Federal pay should be comparable to pay for similar work in the private sector. In 1990, Congress enacted the Federal Employees Pay Comparability Act, FEPCA, which introduced the concept of locality adjustments to make the pay system even more sensitive to geographic market forces. FEPCA requires the Bureau of Labor Statistics to conduct surveys of the 32 separate localities and then provide that information to the President's pay agent, which, as we've heard today, consists of the Secretary of Labor, the Director of OMB, and the Director of OPM, who then have the statutory responsibility of submitting a report to the President each year that lists pay gaps in the 32 areas as well as a national average gap. The pay agent reports showing lower pay for Federal employees have been consistent in Democratic as well as Republican administrations. The reasons that the data from BLS and the Heritage Foundation differ are many. Most importantly, BLS compares actual job duties, not just job titles, but job duties. And as we've heard, more than 54% of Federal workers work in the 9 highest-paying occupation groups. Federal employees are more experienced, they're older, and they have many more years of education, as we've already heard, than private sector workers. With regard to benefits, Federal employees as well as members of Congress are covered by the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program. Enrollees pay on average 30% of the total premium cost. According to Mr. Shirk, in the private sector, workers pay 18% of their premiums for single plans and 29% for family plans. In the 1980s, the Federal Employees Retirement System was created to replace a defined benefit system. There has been discussion about that today also. The earlier plan had serious and growing unfunded liability problems that are similar to those faced by many States today. But the first system today is fully funded and it is financially sound with no unfunded liability. And Federal retirement pensions are not overly generous. Close to 70% of Federal retirees receive annuities of less than $3,000 a month. Mr. Chairman, in a recent interview, you were quoted as indicating your support for instituting so-called pay for performance in the Federal Government. And I'm a big believer in setting goals, meaningful goals, and then figuring out how to reach those goals. With regard to pay for performance, I believe that past conversations have proven that the goals are very often glossed over with statements like, we want flexibility, or it needs to be more modern. It seems to me that a pay system should have a couple of major goals attached to it. Number one, does it help to recruit and retain the best people for the jobs? And number two, does it help to motivate employees to better achieve the agency mission? I don't know of a single so-called pay-for-performance system that is showing progress in either of these goals today in the Federal Government. I discussed the serious problems with several of these systems in my written statement, including those at the TSA and the repealed NSPS system at the Department of Defense. And the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration has gone so far as to say of the IRS manager's pay banding system that the IRS risks reducing its ability to provide quality service to taxpayers because the Internal Revenue pay-for-performance system potentially hinders the IRS's ability to recruit, retain, and motivate highly skilled leaders. The Government Accountability Office has found that the flexibilities that are most effective in managing the Federal workforce include things like time-off awards and flexible work schedules that allow employees to better balance the demands of career and family life. These and other existing flexibilities need to be used more widely. Suggestions have also been made that contracting out more Federal work will lead to more cost efficiency. We have had recent experience with this notion, and it has not proven true. According to OMB, excessive reliance on contractors has eroded the in-house capacity of agencies to perform many critical functions, and it has undermined their ability to accomplish their missions. The Obama administration has begun to reform this out-of-control contracting by requiring agencies to cut wasteful contracting practices and to improve oversight and accountability. These efforts are expected to result in $40 billion in annual savings beginning in 2011. Mr. Chairman, some of the hardest working people I represent make less than $30,000 a year, yet they are facing a 2-year pay freeze, and retirees are in the 2nd year without a cost of living increase. NTEU members understand that the country faces challenges, and although they did not cause the fiscal crisis, they are willing to work to help solve it. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today, and I would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly, and I'll yield myself 5 minutes. Interesting in reading each transcript and in listening to both sides of the dais here is that I think we all believe that we need to recruit and retain and reward good employees in Federal employment. And I think that's some good common ground to begin with. But I also note that in the last panel, there was testimony given about how the Federal workforce has remained almost stable in terms of numbers since President George H.W. Bush until today. But yet there seems to be a correlation also that inversely we've seen an increase in debt significantly since George H.W. Bush, well over 60%. And Mr. Shirk, my question to you is if you were a businessman and you had a workforce, and yet you maintained your same workforce, but you've increased your debt by 60%, would that be indicative of something that needed to be done with your personnel management?
I think it would be a sign that you've got some pretty serious problems.
You mentioned also, you talked briefly about Federal in benefits for Federal employees. What impact does it have on total compensation, the value of Federal employee benefits?
It increases it fairly substantially. If you take a look at only the wage premium, only the cash pay that shows up in your pay stub, Federal employees, again on average, when you're making that apples-to-apples comparison, are making 22% more an hour. But if you then add in the value of those benefits, like the pension benefits, both the defined benefit and the defined contribution pension they receive, and add in the value of those remaining benefits, that compensation premium increases to between 30 and 40%. So they get generous pay and even more generous benefits.
Dr. Biggs, you've discussed that lowering wages would only slightly reduce the quality of the Federal job applicants. Could you discuss any of your work that led to that conclusion?
Well, in our working paper, we actually cited some research by Professor Stephen Venti of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. And the research he looked at is what are called queues for government jobs. The research tries to look at, is there more demand for government jobs than private sector jobs? Are there people waiting out there who would like to get government jobs who cannot? What Professor Venti found was that 3 to 6 times as many people would be willing to accept Federal employment as are actually offered jobs, implying that Federal jobs offer significantly more attractive overall compensation package than private sector employees. Because you have such a large queue for Federal jobs, Venti found that you could cut salaries significantly without hurting the quality of applicants. Venti found that even a 16% reduction in salaries would only slightly reduce the educational qualifications of Federal job applicants. I would add that Professor Kruger of Princeton took an even simpler approach. He measured the number of qualified applicants that Federal job openings received relative to private sector job openings. He found that Federal jobs on average received 25 to 30% more applicants than private sector positions. Again, this is another indication of demand for Federal jobs, which means that if the salary were reduced, you would not see a large reduction in the quality of applicants for Federal positions.
Thank you. Mr. Steer, I want to go to you real quickly, because the general schedule, which has been around since 1949, doesn't take into consideration any market forces, does it?
It doesn't. It takes it now.
Locality.
Locality, correct.
And
not by
that's
occupation.
it.
That's correct.
But in terms of incentivizing somebody to do well, as opposed to somebody just to show up and get a paycheck, it really doesn't make that distinction, does it?
From a recruiting perspective, it's not market sensitive. On the performance side, there are opportunities to give performance bonuses to people to have increased step increases. So there are performance mechanisms that are currently in the system.
And you've talked about, and just to be quick here, you've talked about performance, pay-for-performance programs.
Yes.
And I'd like to know quickly, do you feel that there is an adequate pay-for-performance system out there that would adequately compensate those in the Federal workforce based on outcomes?
Look, I think that the data is clear, which is employees don't believe that they are currently being rewarded for doing better work. So I think the answer is no. The system is not working in the way it ought to. Otherwise, employees would be saying something different.
But do you think there could be one so implemented, a pay-for-performance?
I think that there could be, but I think the work that needs to be done first is to get a handle on how to make sure we know what good performance is and to be able to reward it accordingly.
Okay. Ms. Kelly, what I'd like to do is I want to just have you step aside from your role with the Treasuries Union right now and assume, if you will, that you were in charge of making decisions of a corporation that was showing a significant decline in revenues, so much so that their debt has increased by 60% over a 10-year period of time, and you have to make a decision about personnel. Would you rather pursue a decision about personnel that you would have to let people go or have to reduce their salaries?
Well, the first thing I want to know is what caused the decline in revenue and what caused the debt.
But assuming that it is, I mean, it is what it is. So now you have to make a decision.
If the workforce didn't cause it, then I need to get to the root cause of what it is. And in this case, I think there are a lot of other things to look at. Like,
so you can't say one way or the other what you would do?
Well, as I said, the workforce didn't cause the debt. If they didn't cause the debt, then I think that working with them and figuring out what can be done, and my bet is they're going to have some suggestions of how to change and do the work better and to not do things, for example, like cut taxes on the wealthiest Americans that is probably impacting the revenue that's coming in.
Thank you. I see my time's up. I will now yield to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts and the ranking member, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Kelly, you can put your union hat back on. Look, 60% of the Federal employees work in basically three departments, one being DOD. And we've already had a number of members talk about the fact that we're in two wars. My wife says I spend way too much time in Iraq and Afghanistan. She's probably right. The rest of the employees in that large group work at the VA, and they work at DHS. And I know from my own experience, when we look at what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, I know we have about 10 million private contractors across our government. It's sort of a shadow government. And more responsibilities are being contracted out. And I don't see any reduction in costs. You know, we had a dilemma early on in Afghanistan where we were trying to decide whether embassy personnel, congressional codels should be guarded by Blackwater, who do, look, I've been under the care and protection of Blackwater. They do an amazing job. But let's just look at the costs here for a minute, though. Right now, Blackwater charges us, XE, triple canopy, they charge us about $1,500 a day $1,500 a day for one security officer, whereas if I have a U.S. Marine or Army soldier do it, we're talking about $54,000 a year for the average soldier. So $54,000 a year versus $450,000 a year. And you know, I see in my own district, you know, that goes the same for USAID. USAID does wonderful work in Afghanistan and Iraq, but when that goes over to the contractor side, the price goes right through the roof. And so it just troubles me greatly that people are saying, well, we'll privatize this stuff and we'll save money. That has not been my experience. As well in my own district, you know, I spent a lot of time at the VA. And I got a VA hospital in Brockton, one in West Roxbury, one in Jamaica Plain. And quite frankly, the nurses there, the biggest problem I have is when nurses and therapists being stolen away by the private hospitals in the area. And quite frankly, the one thing that keeps my VA nurses and docs and staff and therapists in place at the VA is that they are so proud to serve veterans. It's their commitment to veterans. They love their job because they're caring for the United States uniformed veterans. That's what's keeping them there. They're working at lower rates, and the private sector hospitals are stealing them away. That's one of my biggest problems, to encourage young nurses to go work at the VA. And I just see a lot of this acrimony and attacks on Federal employees are just not borne out under the facts. Now, Mr. Steer, you do raise a good point about how we can do this better going forward. But President Kelly, I want to ask you, in terms of the folks that you're seeing at NTEU, we're asking you to oversee. In many cases, we're asking you, your folks to oversee tremendous responsibility. They could make a ton of money in the private sector. You mentioned in your testimony there are some gaps and differences in what you see these studies providing and what you see actually in practice at Treasury. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, if you look at, if you ever were a Federal employee and if you know the work that they do, it's not work that you can just measure on a piece of paper. I was an IRS revenue agent for almost 15 years. And as an accountant and a CPA, I know the kinds of Wall Street representatives that the IRS agents have to go up against and be knowledgeable on in order to find the financial schemes and scams that are happening. I mean, that's the kind of talent and skill that you need, and you have to be willing to pay for it. And I also think that in this economy, there's been a lot of talk about how many applications and how willing people are to come work for the government. In this economy, it's one world. I think when the economy turns, and it's obviously taken longer than we all hope, but when it does, I'm very worried about the talent that the Federal Government has been able to recruit and whether or not they're going to be able to keep them. When you look at the compensation and the gaps that are very well known by the employees, they make a conscious decision, as you said. They make a conscious decision every day. Many of them want to work. They have a desire to serve. They have a desire to work for our country, and they're willing to give up some of the extras. But in the long run, and on most days, they want to be treated fairly, and that's really what this conversation is about.
Thank you very much. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. I now recognize the ranking member of the Committee on Oversight, the distinguished gentleman from Maryland. On second thought, I'm going to recognize the distinguished gentlewoman from Washington, D.C., Ms. Norton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Kelly, you and I have sat in this very room when it was less rehabilitated, I must say, in any number of hearings, including joint hearings from Senate and House committees concerned about the state of the Federal workforce, particularly the retiring of the so-called baby boomers. you testified that 90% of the SES, the senior service, could retire within the next 10 years. This, of course, is considered by everybody to be the creme de la creme of the workforce of the United States. These people who were apparently drawn for a number of reasons, the post-Kennedy folks. There's been a lot of discussion here about Federal employees, but little discussion about a return on investment that any employer will understand. When you hire an employee, let's take people in this very room. If you see one of your employees in whom you have invested time and energy walk out the door, you're seeing your investment in that employee walk out of the door as well. And so the investment, the return on your investment becomes important if that is a high quality employee. The others on the panel have apparently agreed that there is a greater return on experience in the Federal workforce, and that may account for some of the promotions. We know this. Rapid turnover takes investment, of course, out of the door. I wish you would describe, and of course the notion of promotion from within encourages people to stay, and you want to encourage competition. If you want people to compete for these employees, you at least want to keep your investment in the Federal sector. So you'd like the investment to occur among Federal agencies rather than have the private sector benefit from the investment of the taxpayers in the Federal employee. I wish you would describe that in places like the IRS and the other agencies you represent.
There are many employees who begin their work for the Federal Government in an entry-level position in whatever their agency is. And what they hope is that they will see opportunities to move into new positions, to be promoted, to learn, to enhance their skills, to receive training, and to move up within the agency so they can do more complex and more important work for the agency. In agencies where those promotion opportunities do not exist, you will tend to see people leave more, because obviously people want to know that they have some opportunity in the future. But I also have to believe that happens in the private sector. Most people do not go into a job and want to stay in that specific job, in that occupation for their entire career. They are looking for opportunities to grow. And in the Federal Government, the idea that there are so many different jobs and so much important work across agencies gives employees the opportunity to do just that, and they take advantage.
Yeah, and of course the Federal Government has made a decision. It wants career employees. It is a career service. It's a civil service. I wish you would describe, there have been some inflammatory statements made by others on the panel about collective bargaining in Wisconsin and the rest. There seems to be very little understanding of the role that unions can play when there needs to be reductions in the workforce, when there need to be give-backs of some kind in the workforce, as opposed to when you have to do that and nobody is there to make the employers understand how it occurred. The President has had a management workers council. I wonder if you describe how that works. Well,
about a year ago, labor management forums were created under an executive order that the President signed, and that executive order has as its underpinning the idea of collaboration, and that working together we can figure out some of the most difficult problems that we face, and that has included situations, as you described, Congresswoman Norton, where the workforce has to change because the work of the agency changes, and either work goes away, and therefore there needs to be a smaller workforce, and it is the unions working side by side with management to deal with these very, very difficult issues, to try to do two things. One, ensure that the agency is able to continue to be successful in whatever its mission is, but at the same time to do all they can to have employees have opportunities to be placed somewhere else, to make sure that those skills, those experiences are not lost. But when there have had to be those kinds of situations, The only way that it happens in a way that's successful for the agency and for the workforce, in my view, is if the unions are working with management and if management has the unions in every conversation so that it's something that we can craft the best solution to.
That's how you get labor peace. Thank you very much, Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. Now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shirk, let me ask you, are you a fan of pay for performance?
I think it's a good idea. It needs to be done correctly, but in the general principle, yes.
Do you think it can be broadly used or could be broadly used in the, say, the Federal Government?
Broadly speaking, yes.
Okay. And we would expect better results than what we get in terms of productivity as well as how we compensate our employees?
If it's designed correctly, you should.
Dr. Biggs, let me ask you, you were here when Mr. Berry was testifying, and you heard him talk about comparing apples with apples and oranges with oranges, and to arrive at the conclusion that you made relative to the comparability of public versus private sector pay. Is that the methodology that you used?
I'll pick my words carefully here and say that Director Berry did not correctly describe the methodology that I have used in this study or that others like Mr. Shirk or academics have used. The claim he made was that Federal employees are better educated on average than private sector employees, and that's a correct claim. He also claimed, though, that the pay studies that I have done and that others have done do not correctly account for that we're comparing apples and oranges. In fact, that's totally untrue. The studies that we have done control for differences between the education and other characteristics of the Federal workforce and the private sector workforce. In other words, we compare apples to apples. We control for these differences. The Federal pay agents analysis, which finds a pay penalty of 20 to almost 25%, by contrast, that doesn't take education into account. It looks at a job but does not account for the fact that private sector employers tend to put more educated, more experienced individuals into those jobs than public sector employers do. And we know that the value coming out of a job is a combination of the job and the inputs of the individual himself. So I would say he miscorrectly characterized the study that I did.
Well, let me ask you, based upon your description, would a clerk at Walmart be the same as a clerk in one of our agencies if you were looking at the two?
In general, no. In general, we don't categorize people by job types. We categorize them by what's called the human capital they're bringing to the game. A clerk in the Federal Government would generally have at least a high school education, a bachelor's degree, and so we're counting the educational experience, the other experiences they may have, which will partly account for them getting better pay. I'm not, and our study doesn't say Federal employees shouldn't be higher paid on average than private sector employees. The question is, how much higher should they be paid? By controlling for differences in education, experience, and other factors, we can find the effect of working in the Federal Government or outside in the private sector. And what we find and what other studies consistently have found in peer-reviewed research over the past 3 decades is that if you take the same individual and put them in the Federal Government versus the private sector, that individual will get a significant salary premium in the Federal Government. That's not just what we're saying. That's what the peer-reviewed research consistently says.
Mr. Steer, let me ask you, you began your testimony by suggesting that maybe we were asking the wrong questions or exploring the wrong possibilities and options, and that what we really ought to be looking at is how do we get the best workforce that we possibly can for the price that we are prepared to pay. Could you re-articulate that for me?
I may have this wrong, but in listening to everybody here, I thought I heard everyone agree to the proposition that at some point in looking at the totality of the Federal workforce, there are going to be some folks that are underpaid, some that are overpaid, and there are some that are paid just right. There may be differences about what the proportions are amongst the panel, but that general proposition is one that appears to have been accepted by everybody here. I think then the next question that has to be asked is, how do we design a system that does a better job of actually ensuring that we are being as cost-effective as possible to get the right talent, the best talent for government? And my proposition would be that that is the conversation we should be having, and I've proposed a set of principles that I hope can help push that conversation forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now you're back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. The Chair now recognizes the Ranking Member of the Oversight Committee, distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Biggs, let me make sure I understand this right. You're saying that, in answer to one of the Chairman's questions, you were saying that there is a great demand for these Federal jobs? Is that right?
That's what research has indicated, yes.
And so, and because there's a great demand, what does that have to do with pay? To remind us.
A higher demand for Federal jobs does not prove that they are overpaid. It is an indicator that individuals in the marketplace judge the package they are going to get from Federal employment, which includes salaries, benefits, other characteristics of the work, more attractive than they would find private sector work. You find similar indicators in things like quit rates for Federal employees. Those are consistently lower than the private sector. There could be other reasons for low quit rates. That is indicative that, in general, it offers people an attractive compensation package, yes.
Well, most members of Congress spend and collect millions of dollars to come here, and most could make a lot more money than what they're making. Apparently, there's something that members want that comes from this public service that we do. By the way, we are Federal employees, public servants. And I'm just wondering, is that one of those other things that you just talked about, that is a desire? I mean, when I talk to nurses, for example, and I talk to people who are in that kind of profession, they will tell you in a minute, in most instances, I love my job because I'm able to help people. This is what I always wanted to be ever since I was a little boy, a little girl, and this is something that really means something to me. And, you ask them, well, does it bother you to have to be cleaning up blood and all that kind of stuff? And they say no, because it's what they really, really want to do. When I talk to the people up here on the Hill, a lot of them will come, and I've seen this many times, and I'm sure everybody up here can tell you the similar stories. They want to come not so much for the pay. As a matter of fact, a lot of them are making a lot less pay. I literally just interviewed, just a few minutes ago, somebody who's willing to take a 15% cut because he wants to be a part of government, of helping people. So how much does that play? And Ms. Kelly, I want you to be thinking about that too. How much do you, I mean, is that part of that little formula you just gave us?
No, I would not in any way deny that a desire for public service and a desire to serve your country is an attraction for many people for serving the Federal government. For myself, it has been when I served as congressional staffer.
Oh, you served? You were a public employee?
Excuse
Okay.
I know it's very hard to believe.
No. I just want to make you.
It's sort of the desire to serve for public service is strong and is legitimate. The question would be, if what we had was simply a queue for Federal jobs or low quit rates, that could be entirely attributable to a desire for public service. The results you find from pay studies, though, which control for education, experience, and the rest, and they find that the same person would earn a higher salary on average in the Federal government than the private sector, that is something which tends towards the view that there is overcompensation. One of the aspects of the study we did was not simply controlling for differences in education and so forth. We followed the same people over time using Census Bureau data. When those individuals switched from private sector employment to Federal employment, on average, they got a pay increase. That does not mean every person gets a pay increase in the Federal Government. It does not mean that the highest, best qualified Federal employees couldn't earn more in the private sector. It does mean that on average, the same person would earn a higher salary and much more generous benefits in the Federal Government than they would outside.
Well, let me put it like, now you really just said something very interesting, because a lot of people are constantly trying to move forward, right? Hello. I assume that when you moved from public servant, you apparently made, I guess, more money, did you?
Well, I make less money now than I did.
Okay. Well, you're making my case. In other words, what you just said, I mean, usually if somebody's going to move from one job to another, in many instances, they're going to move to more pay. So if they're going to move from public to private, I mean, from private to public, and they're moving on a normal course, it's logical, I guess, that they're going to make more money.
It is, but we controlled for that difference. Most people get a pay increase when they switch jobs. That's natural. Getting a pay increase is one of the main reasons why people do switch jobs. What we found was private sector workers who found a new job in the Federal Government received pay around 8% higher than private sector workers who found a new job in the private sector. So you have the same person getting different jobs, and this has been replicated in other studies as well. So we're not simply saying, do you get a pay increase when you find a new job, because most people do. We're saying, do you get a larger pay increase if you find a new Federal job than if you find a new private sector job? And the answer to that is yes.
I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. Now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Steer, is turnover in certain categories of job in the Federal Government a problem?
Yes, it is. And if I might just take 2 seconds, the name is Steyer. It looks like Steer, but parents decide pronunciation. So I've heard it too many times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The answer is yes, absolutely. If you look at the overall attrition number relative to the overall private sector number, it is lower. But in the critical areas, new employees, first 2 years, it's actually about 25%. You heard already nursing, it's close to 18%. My favorite distressing example is the Department of Homeland Security. Between 2003 and 2007, the first 4 years, 3/4 of the SES left. And what's amazing is no one was paying attention, no one did exit interviews to find out why. But the point is, what we really ought to be looking at is not generic attrition, but attrition for the people we need to keep that are really vital.
Exactly. So when we actually look at certain categories of employees, actually the attrition might be considerably higher than in the private sector, despite
Absolutely.
what we've heard. And your point, we have not bothered to find out why.
Correct.
Which most private sector firms I know do exit interviews.
The good ones do.
Yeah, the good ones do. Ms. Kelly, can you think of some other categories of Federal workers where turnover is high?
The highest rate of turnover for the past few years has been at TSA, those who protect our skies. The turnover rate up until about a year ago was running at over 20%.
A year?
Yes.
So these fat Federal salaries and cushy jobs and wonderful working conditions somehow don't prevent 20% of the workforce from leaving every year.
Exactly. And these TSA workers all earn less than $30,000 a year. There is no way they could be put into a category of overpaid anything.
Mr. Steyer, a few years ago when we had a much lower unemployment rate, I mean, I'm hearing testimony about how actually a lot of people are flocking to Federal service or public service. Well, of course, when you've got an almost 10% unemployment rate, my guess would be historically that's a pattern. But when you're looking at, say, 4% unemployment rate, especially in the higher end skill sets, my guess would be that the labor market gets real tight in being able to recruit and retain skilled workers for the Federal workforce. Would that be true?
Absolutely. And as you suggested, already, even with high unemployment, there are certain skill sets that the Federal Government is having a very hard time recruiting.
For example?
Well, the cybersecurity area is one that is obviously front and center. You've got examples with nursing.
Wait, let's stop with cybersecurity for a minute.
Sure.
I happen to represent a high-tech district. Why would that be a problem? Why are we having trouble recruiting people to work in the area of cybersecurity?
Because there's a lot of competition.
And it requires a high skill set.
Absolutely.
Technical skill set.
Yes.
What percentage of the Federal workforce is eligible for retirement over this decade?
Again, you're looking at, depending again on you're looking at over half.
Over half.
A very large portion of the population will be eligible to retire. And again, I think the general numbers are less important than looking at the specific populations that we should be most concerned about. And there you see much higher numbers.
So if I listen just to what I've heard from Mr. Shirk and Dr. Biggs, I would assume that, frankly, we're not going to have any trouble at all filling 50% of the existing Federal slots as people retire over this next decade. Is that your view as well, Mr. Starr?
It is my view that there will be no problem filling the slots. The question is filling with whom, and are you getting the right talent?
Well, no, of course, that's the question.
And I think the answer is that we have to do a better job in a lot of different respects if we really want to have the right talent in government.
Ms. Kelly, do you have a view on that subject?
I'm very worried about the ability to fill the positions when they're vacated. And, for years, everyone talked about this tsunami that was coming of Federal retirement. And it didn't come in large part because of the economy. But it will come. It will happen. And agencies are not positioned to be able to hire at the skill level, the skill set, to be able to maintain what it is they're trying to do in their agencies today.
And of course, a final note, if I might be allowed an observation, the more we debase Federal service, the less attractive we make it. And we go to Mr. Steyer's point, then you have to worry about who you're attracting to Federal service, especially in the higher skill set. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I now recognize the Vice Chair of this subcommittee, the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Shirk and Dr. Biggs and all of you, thank you for being here today. Mr. Shirk and Dr. Biggs, I have a question. How much would the Federal Government save if it equalized benefits with those provided in the private sector?
I took a look at both pay and benefits. I didn't take a look at benefits specifically. If you'd like that, I could get it later. But if you took pay and benefits together, you'd save about $47 billion this year under my accounting.
I think that's about right, yeah.
Thank you. Another question. Excuse me for a second. Yeah. Ms. Kelly, your union represents a cross-section of Federal workers who perform many key functions of government. Since the pay freeze was enacted, how many of your members have left Federal service?
I couldn't give you an exact number. I can tell you that many are talking about leaving, and many who have been eligible to retire and were not going to, and who plan to stay, are now talking about leaving. I think that we will see real numbers in the foreseeable future, but I could not give you a number today.
I have a general question to any of you who can answer it. The President has talked about freezing pay for 2 years. Does this include the within-grade step adjustments, which are 3% a year?
No, it doesn't cover those at all. It's purely the cost of living adjustment. But the vast majority of Federal employees are going to receive these with the in-grade adjustments, and we'll get those 3% raises.
And when Mr. Berry was here earlier, he testified that there should be no place in the Federal Government for non-performers to hide. How would you respond to the fact that Federal Government rarely fires employees, and in the majority of cases, pay raises result from length of service rather than job performance?
It's a pretty serious problem. Once they pass their probationary year, which is the first year, within that first year, it's about 20% of Federal employees either quit or are fired. But after that, it's very, very rare to see a Federal employee get fired. And there's also very few rewards for performing above and beyond just a mediocre level. Federal managers rarely award performance ratings below 3 because it's a lengthy appeals process. The employees have basically get to appeal and can challenge an adverse decision. Most managers simply don't want to go through the hassle. They want to manage the agency, not do that kind of work. So they almost always hand out a 3 or higher rating. The employees, they qualify for the step increases, but very little above and beyond that is there in terms of performance pay. So it's simply designed to encourage mediocrity, but not going above and beyond that, and very tough to get rid of the bad apples after the first year.
And in my opinion, showing an acceptable level of competence is not sufficient for raising a person's salary. Would you agree that productivity, work ethic, dedication, performance, and exceeding expectations are the proper criteria for a salary increase?
Sure. I don't want to in any way demean the work ethic and the dedication of Federal employees. I've worked with them over significant periods of time, and as Director Berry said, you are very surprised at how hardworking people are. At the same time, it does not serve the hardworking, dedicated Federal employees when people who are not pulling their weight essentially cannot be fired. It's a natural process in any business that some people do very, very well and are promoted, others don't do very well and are fired. To explain the Federal rates of firing, we would have to assume the Federal Government is extremely good at picking employees such that it never finds anybody who doesn't work out. It's just not plausible. You want to retain good employees. You want them to build up the job-specific skills that really do add to productivity, but you also want to have the flexibility to move on people who are not working out as well. And I think you need to find a strong balance between those two.
Congressman, can I add to this, though? I think the things that you identified are important, but I also think that performance is important, and I think that performance is an aspect of the Federal system today. And the flaws that are being described and are being grossly overstated, that Federal employees can never be fired, because they are fired. Federal employees are fired after their probationary period. And if they are not fired at the rates that somebody thinks they shouldn't be, then someone needs to look at the implementation of the system within the agencies. And that means managers are not being trained on how to deal with poor performers. They are not doing what they should be doing to either help them correct that performance or to move them out of the agency. That's the manager's job. That has nothing to do with the system. It's about the managers, and it's about what the system supports for them from a training perspective as well as an implementation perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Amash. That completes our questions. Mr. Lynch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record the statements of the American Federation of Government Employees, the National Federation of Federal Employees, and the National Active and Retired Federal Employees.
Without objection, so ordered. That completes our program. I want to thank our panel very much for being here. Appreciate your patience, and we stand adjourned. Thank you.